The first one, of course, is lower complexity. The ability to be able to see everything in a single place, to be able to understand where what your rights are, back to that whole tangible intangible factor I was talking about before, just being able to see it all. Cisco built a lot of this in through their smart accounts. Next benefit, lowering cost. Since you can see your overall capacity here and all the licenses that you have available, you should be able to have better information for future planning and only plan for things that you need and not for things that you don't need. And then finally, of course, increased agility. And by this, what we mean is that you have the ability to get the software that you need and the software licenses you need without necessarily having to go through all the ramifications of a purchase order, if you do get things incorrect, especially on not having enough. This is also absolutely true, but the part that we're going to walk through right now is how, if you don't put some best practices into place, all three of those benefits that I just articulated, the opposite can actually happen, right? There's actually a danger here that without, again, proper procedures and proper process, that each one of these things essentially becomes its opposite. So let's talk about financial predictability, and being able to save money. Well, if you didn't set up the EA correctly in its first place, if it wasn't properly sized, the problem is that you kind of go from iteration to iteration. You're always looking backwards. You're always looking back at, what did we do last time? And well, that's an obviously, good starting point. But if that starting point was set incorrectly, then you have issues with that. Furthermore, because of that agility that I was just talking about, the ability to kind of get what you need out of the contract quickly and easily, if you don't have a process in place to monitor that consumption, to make sure that only the right things are pulled out when they need to be pulled out, and then essentially the opposite begins happening, right? You actually end up with things like financial unpredictability, because the true forwards end up being unpredictable, because you're not making sure that the right things are happening against that contract. Similarly, you can end up with either underuse or this unintended growth that I was just mentioning as well too. I've actually seen lots of real world examples out there where those who are out there actually deploying the licenses, they don't work in procurement, right? They don't worry about things like how much something costs. They just want to get their job done to the best of their abilities. And so in many cases, either they're not aware or they don't even think about the fact that pulling additional licenses out of agreements actually can cause them to grow. Maybe they've already pulled the right licenses out and they can just move them around. Okay. And so you've got to have the proper processes in place, or you do end up with this unintended growth. And then finally, you can have all of the best portals and views of your overall license visibility, but if you don't essentially establish the practice of monitoring it and looking at it and talking about when issues actually happen, and it's only something that you look at when it comes time to renewals, you're going to have giant surprises in it. Okay. And so while there's this giant benefit of all of a sudden having all this visibility and additional data, if you ignore that data, then having it doesn't really help you. And so where I'm going to focus here is how we can kind of work on addressing each of these issues, because the last thing in the world that we want to happen is that these benefits that we've just sold to everybody, all of a sudden they become disadvantages. And I've seen this actually happen multiple times in real life, over the years, through various programs where where the marketing, just doesn't quite match up with the results at the end. It actually doesn't mean that, all those results weren't delivered, right? It just means that the customer actually didn't receive the value. And how can we fix that? Our goal at the end of the day is to make sure that you have a happy customer, right? That they think that this enterprise agreement that they ended up getting here was the best choice they possibly could have made, and don't end up having buyer's remorse because of it afterwards. And how do we make sure that we're helping them actually achieve their goals? Okay, so let's start by just talking about a couple of the things that are probably a little obvious here, but are important to understand kind of the end-to-end life cycle. We start out with a traditional view of just how license subscriptions are achieved, over a period of time. So basically, you've got a series of purchase events. You've got multiple subscriptions. Subscriptions are overlapping on each other. And effectively, the outcome is you really never know at any given time, what that license load ends up looking like. You purchase some new things, subscriptions end, then licenses go away, and then other subscriptions happen, and maybe your subscriptions overlap. I've got a 1 year and a 3 year subscription here, and they result in different times in which events actually happen. And so it becomes essentially very mysterious as to when life cycle actions should actually happen on this. One of the, in my opinion, the big benefits of an enterprise agreement is it brings predictability, or at least the framework of predictability, onto all of this planning. So you've got various either true up or true forward events that happen over a period of time. You set up your agreement in the first place. Sometimes a true forward might increase your license load, and that's because you're being agile and you're bringing new software assets into the agreement, as the customer grows. Sometimes it doesn't change at all because what you previously had, you were either able to reuse or maybe there wasn't any growth. But there might be a couple of years of true forwards, and then there's renewal. At a renewal, that gives you an opportunity to either move up or down. Your renewals don't just mean that you just decrease the number of licenses. It's actually an opportunity to reflect and look at, well, did I actually use all these things? Did I size this correct? Nope. Let me resize it down here a little bit, or yep, let me resize it up a little bit more. But it gives you those points in which to reflect and kind of get these numbers right. And so, like I said, it's this predictability that we're going to lean into. The next part is let's consider the life cycle. So again, since this is a Cisco focused conversation, we're going to use the Cisco CX racetrack. Most people are probably very, very familiar with this as this is becoming more and more common in conversations. But what I'm going to point out on this is that there are different pit stops. There are different points on this customer life cycle that are more important than others. And there are points on this that people tend to focus today and tend to put all of their efforts into, and they may not necessarily be the right points. And so kind of left to your own to people's own devices, a lot of times the easiest thing to do is just focus on the start and stop points. Okay, the initial purchase itself, the deployment of these, and then the renewal events that happen later. So I'm kind of these items kind of highlighted in red along this racetrack right here. Now my argument back to you is that if you really want to be successful with these enterprise agreements, you've got to hit all these points in the middle. And this is actually the hard part. Okay, so you've got to work a little bit harder for this data. You've got to, there's a couple of additional data sources that you need for this, but it's actually essential to be able to accomplish this. And so An elevated customer success lifecycle, again, it's not that we're introducing anything new here. We're just putting our focus across a wider range of areas in the life cycle to make sure that we have all this data as well too. It's not just about the purchase events, so kind of the start and stop of this side of the life cycle. It's also about everything that happens in between, right? Especially this use piece right here. What are all the MACDs that happen over time? What happens with the actual customer adoption and optimization of the assets that they acquire as part of these agreements? Are we continually evaluating these and making sure that they're part of the discussion? And how can we use this data to actually inform and drive the evaluate and purchase phases and renew phases themselves? So we're going to look at the data that's really necessary here to be able to go through. The main sort of data that's typically used today for EA pricing and sizing is what I have highlighted here in the top left hand, okay, the previous license purchases. Now, this is still incredibly important information. This is probably one of the top items that's necessary, but more often than not, this is the only thing that is considered when doing proper sizing. So you're looking at Salesforce.com, you're looking at Cisco eAMP if you have access to that, you're looking at prior sales records and trying to piece all this together and trying to figure out the licenses from there. So if you knew what the customer bought in the past, then you are likely to know what the customer is going to want to renew or purchase in the future. However, to really be able to understand what the customer wants to renew in the future, we need to focus on the license utilization as well too. It's not only what they bought, it's what they deployed. Well, the first thing people say is, well, how do I know this? Like, how am I supposed to even understand, what this is? Now, obviously, this is something that usually kind of rolls into a modern customer success practice anyway. But one of the big suggestions that I have on this is that you leverage the actual license key cutters themselves. You determine if the license has been deployed based off of its activation records that you can usually get access to. Now, with Cisco, they actually make it easy to do this based off of the Cisco Smart Account. All it takes is access to this. And the Smart Account was really designed by Cisco to be leveraged by partners. It's the way in which partners and customers are supposed to be able to communicate with each other about purchases and other customer success factors. And so it was designed that way from the very beginning. And it's recommended that we kind of continue making that point. There's other places where this information might come from, and so I've got a bunch of Cisco acronyms in here. LRP, the License Registration Portal. MCE is my Cisco entitlements. And these are just great sources of data for being able to pull back information on license utilization. Now, obviously, why do we care about this? And it's pretty straightforward. If you know that the customer's bought 100 things and that they're using 90 of those things, then it's a pretty good indication that I've sized this pretty close to being correct. If they're using 100 things and their utilization says that they're using 120, well, not only is that a bit of an audit risk, but it becomes an immediate conversation on, all right, we need to up the size. Or conversely, they bought 100 things and it looks like their actual utilization is 0. Then maybe that's something that we should look at not renewing, and we should focus in other areas that are more impactful for the customer. And a lot of times just having this basic information on utilization, it presents so many aha moments about what's important and what's not important, that it really ups the level of the game on sizing that EA properly in the first place. There are a couple of other data points that I think are also important as well. So the two on the top that are listed as primary contributors, like that are what we just focused on. But let's focus on some secondary contributors as well. And I find both of these highly useful for proper sizing of agreements. The first one is just on asset counts themselves. Okay, and this has some very pragmatic and tactical reasons why I like to bring this information in as well. Um, there are some places where license utilization doesn't tell the full story, especially in places where you don't require licenses to actually be deployed. If it's more like an honor-based model, for example. There's lots of situations that are out there. The easiest example I can give you is the Catalyst series, the 9Ks and higher. I can't tell you how many situations that I have seen out there in the world because of the way that these particular sets of products were released. Um, they will happily continue working, even if they're still on an evaluation license. I've gotten into many conversations where we take a look at this and we go, yep, we can see that like 10% of the devices were deployed correctly, and the other 90% are out there running in evaluation mode, right? Which usually raises all kinds of alarms. Both from the from the reseller perspective, from the OEM perspective, and from the security and compliance perspective from the customers, because they want to make sure that that their things are properly licensed and that they've got all the right licenses installed. And so one of the checkpoints we use many times is actually asset counts, right? This especially works well for on-prem devices, not as much for SaaS or cloud-based platforms. But if you've got some sort of either a virtual machine or type of device that these licenses apply to, just a simple count of those product IDs can actually tell you if the primary contributors are telling you the full story or if you're missing something. So it's definitely something I like to bring in as well. And finally, just other additional license info. There's other things that you need to have information on to really be able to tell the full story. Like, what are my transferability behaviors? Can I move licenses around between different endpoints? Am I trying, like, for example, if I'm doing a follow the sun model, do I need, and I've got 3 data centers around the world, do I need a license for each data center, or can I, move the license from data center 1 to data center 2 to data center 3 because I'm only using, only one of them at a time? And so being able to understand, what the rules and regulations in place on a per device basis or per product basis can help you make sure that you, again, size these things correctly. Again, what are some other things here that are important? What are compliance behaviors? What are the things that are actually counted? Does it count users? Does it count cores? Is it just a feature license that you apply on a device by device basis? These are the types of questions that come up that I think are also important to throw into the mix as well. So with that, and you truly want to build an end-to-end story here on how enterprise agreements actually work for, oops, sorry. How all these pieces work together. There's a little bit of data stitching that has to be done. And back to the Cisco example, there's not a single portal, and this is why people have issues and questions on this a lot. You've got the EA workspace, you've got smart accounts, and then you've got things like CX Cloud that are coming up as well too. But you've got to understand how these data elements attach to each other. So the EA workspace, which is basically contains all the information about which you have contractual rights to, does an excellent job of that, by the way, of giving you all of the information about, what suites have been purchased and, what's been consumed and not consumed. But just because something is in the EA workspace doesn't mean that it's an actual license. It means that it has at least the potential to become a license. And so the very first measurement that I like to put in place is, all right, of all this potential, of everything in the EA workspace, what's been converted into a license and what's left unconverted, right? What are the things that you've essentially forgot about or that you're not, paying attention to that, potentially the customer could end up using, okay? And you can see all of that in the EA workspace relatively easily. And then there's the smart account. And the smart account is where all of the licenses themselves are actually stored. And one of the things that I think is a giant pitfall for everybody is licenses are not the same thing as the software SKUs that are in the EA workspace. Okay, and again, these potentialities of becoming a license. Let me give you just kind of an example here. So in the EA workspace, you might pick a particular license, and that license it belongs to a suite. Let's say an enterprise. A wireless enterprise license, so you pick that, and that selects a license SKU, and that license SKU actually becomes 3 different licenses. Well, why does it become 3 different licenses? Well, there's actually maybe 2 different types of platforms that this suite can support, and maybe there's a management license that goes along with it. And these things are all named very differently. And so one of the big confusions that people kind of come up with is, all right, so I look at my enterprise agreement, I can see that, I've consumed some licenses. I go in and look at my smart account, and I have a hard time reconciling these 2 with each other. And the reason why the smart account is important is it tells you, back to what I was talking about before, about the deployments. It tells you about things like, what was deployed, what's not deployed, what's borrowed. Borrowed is actually an interesting concept as well, too, because what borrowed means is that you bought the gold level of service, but you're using the silver level of service. You're actually using a lower level of service than you had originally purchased, and so that maybe it's not that you're not licensing everything, but maybe you're getting a lower level of service than you're actually entitled to. So that becomes an important data point as well, too. And so what you have to be able to do is you need to be able to stitch all of this together to be able to tell that story. Okay, you need to be able, and so this is especially important for renewals. This is especially important for things like planning for true forwards and what's going to happen here, because you can actually be out of compliance in the smart account, but still have excess licenses sitting in your EA workspace. So what you need to do is you need to move the license over to the smart accounts. But once it's in the smart account, you can't put it back in the EA workspace. And so if I need that license again, then usually due to transferability rules, then you can actually move it around in the customer's network as appropriate. You don't need to go pull it out of your enterprise agreement again, right? If usage needs changes. You can use those licenses that you've already pulled out. So it's really, really important that you are paying attention to both, and that you are making both sets of data available to yourself as well as to your customers, so that you can make better purchasing and EA sizing decisions for the future. So what I'm showing you here is actually an example of, at least one of the ways that Ray Allen has pulled some of this data together. And this is actually just an example, using one of our sample customers here. But the whole idea is, at the end of the day, you want to be able to tell a story. You want to be able to tell a story about how successful enterprise agreement adoption actually is in real time, with your customer success team, with your customers, and of course, obviously with procurement, because at the end of the day, this is what they're going to care about. We need as I was talking about before, we need to be able to understand how much of the EA was actually consumed, right? How much of that was turned into an actual license that can now be deployed on an endpoint. And then once that becomes a license, then the next question, this percent deployed from EA, is how much of it was actually deployed? And you can kind of see, kind of what we're showing here. You would kind of go through items suite by suite and be able to tell you things like, what's the undeployed value of a given suite? What's the over deployed value of a given suite? If there's any true forwards that are popping up, kind of in real time. The last thing that you want is to show up with a true forward or true up with a customer, right before the actual event happens, because maybe the issue actually happened 6 months ago. Nobody has any clue about what happened 6 months ago. So it's best to kind of deal with these issues as they come up, rather than have to look back in time and go, oh yeah, 6 months ago, that's when we opened up a new branch and deployed a lot of new devices over there that were kind of unexpected. And so anyway, it allows us to kind of stay on top of that. While at the same time, it allows us to be able to deal with issues as they happen. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that that a user will come in and will end up using some of the portals incorrectly. Like I said, the people who buy licenses are not the same people as those who deploy licenses. And if you don't, put some guardrails in place around this or help the customer actually do this, then what's going to happen is they're going to make mistakes, as humans do. And it kind of becomes up to, the collective us to resolve those mistakes. And if we can identify those mistakes, as they happen, again, more in real time. Oh, I can see that Bob, just pulled out 10 new licenses for some ISRs, but it turns out that, oh, we already have those licenses in place. We didn't need an additional 10 licenses. They were just in a different folder that he didn't look in. And so it's so much easier to deal with rectifying errors if you do it within the first 30 days. If you wait until the true forward notification comes, it's a much bigger task, both from just figuring out what happened in the first place, as well as it no longer becomes a self-service task. You can't fix it yourself. Now you've got to get GLOW involved. And for those of you who haven't heard that acronym before, GLOW is Cisco's Global Licensing Office. Their licensing tack, if you will. And obviously you want to deal with things self-service wherever you can, just because it's definitely going to improve your overall time to resolution and just getting things fixed very quickly and easily. All right. So anyway, one last topic on this, and this is just a little bit of a bonus topic, and this is something that I find that people don't always think about a lot, but as one of the best practices that I find really adds a lot of value downstream. There's also some other courses we teach on, like smart account management and how to set up smart accounts correctly and how to think about them correctly and how to organize a customer. Obviously, it tends to be focused on Cisco, but honestly, it applies to any vendor that has any sort of enterprise account and a way to organize things. You've got essentially the same question and same set of problems. But this particular thing is very Cisco centric. When you set up a smart account and you set up all your virtual accounts underneath, so this is a kind of a typical medium-sized customer, and of course you've got your default account that comes with it. And then I split it up into a voice services and security and a management and a lab. And, I've got a couple different branches. I got a US branch and an EMEA branch account, just because that's how the customer wants to think of themselves. One of the things that you're going to notice about when you have an EA is that it is going to create these new accounts for you. Okay, there's going to be a collaboration EA virtual account. There's going to be a DNA EA virtual account. And all of the licenses out of your EA are going to get deposited into there. Okay, now the reason why I bring this up is there's a very strong tendency among the user base that I've seen to just use the licenses directly out of that virtual account. I want to give you a slightly different way of thinking about that. The entire point of virtual accounts or any sort of other sub accounts, again, beyond Cisco, is that they allow you to split things up into different financially impacting budgets. Okay, I can keep my US branch budget separate from my EMEA branch budgets. And so that's something, kind of particularly important for most people. But if you just deploy everything out of your DNA EA, just because that's where they happen to show up first, then you lose those benefits. You lose that ability to tease the information back apart from each other. Now, some people get this and they do this right off of the bat. But like I said, I more often than not, I see people falling into this trap. My recommendation is think of these virtual accounts set up for EAs just like a default account, okay? And for serving the same purposes. The reason why the default account exists, okay, on a Cisco Smart account is because it's the garbage collector, right? It's the place where things go when you don't know where they should go, okay? And it's like an intake. It's where how things enter the system. But most the recommendation, of course, is move things out of your default account and get all my voice licenses into my voice account, get all my management licenses into my management account so the management group can deal with it, get all my lab licenses into my lab account. And the same thing holds true for your EA accounts. So for example, in this DNA EA, which is going to be your routing and switching and wireless as it's set up, don't just leave it here and deploy things out of it, okay? Because you're going to lose that visibility and you're going to lose those metrics. Set up the right practice where the licenses are getting delivered to the right groups. This way, it allows the customer to understand, for example, hey, it's, my US group is using 60% of it and my EMEA group is using 40% of it. Otherwise, this data becomes a really difficult exercise at a later point. If you just set up the practice now from the very beginning, then basically your when it becomes time for renewals, when it becomes time to figure out percentages that different groups are using for different for these agreements, it becomes something incredibly easy to do rather than a 2-month exercise involving 45 spreadsheets. But if you just set yourself up for success on your EAs and your virtual accounts, then you'll find success down the line. So with that, I'll kind of bring this conversation kind of to its natural conclusion. So first off, like I said, when you're setting up enterprise agreements, size it right, okay? And there's more that we can do here than just looking at prior agreements. Look at your deployment data, look at your inventories, look at your license info beyond just what previous purchases were. That's how you kind of raise your game, from an A to an A plus, right? Is being able to use that additional information, be able to craft the customer sizing to really what it should be based off of their historical utilization, not just off of their historical purchases. The communications has to continue, right? Successful enterprise agreements don't happen by accident, okay? They happen because you will them to be successful. And the way that you make them successful is you make sure that all along the way, you've got checkpoints. You're making sure that the customers understand, what they're using, what they're not using. It's part of your communication process back to them. You're able to tell them, hey, you're doing great on this part of your EA. You've achieved all your goals. This other part over here, maybe not so much, right? Maybe your plans have changed, but don't let this be, a surprise that comes up at renewal time. Let this be a conversation that comes up, all along the way, right? It's something that you do on purpose, not something that happens by accident. And that similarly is true for the true forwards as well. By following the license utilization data, as I was kind of walking you through on the smart accounts, then as well as pulling information out of the EA workspace on a kind of a continual basis and looking at what those true ups are going to be, you're going to be able to do two things. You're going to be able to, number one, fix problems or do value shifts as you identify them. But number two, if this is very legitimate growth, you get the customer prepared, right? Back to that whole benefit at the very beginning about predictable financial impact. This is how you make it predictable. And then finally, you have to demonstrate this value over time, okay? And if things don't prove out to be what you thought them to be, make adjustments. Use this data to continue advising your customer in the right direction. Renewals shouldn't just be whatever it was last time. It's got to be based off of, like I said, what was used, what was not used, and continually rolling with the punches here of how real life actually impacts the plan of what the customer thought they were going to do in the first place. So with that, if there's any other questions, feel free to pop them in. I'm just looking through my list just to see if I see a bunch of questions about the recording. Will the presentation be shared? Absolutely to all of that. So you will be able to see all of this. If you would like to have any deeper conversations on this, please reach out to us. I've got the email address here at the bottom. We're happy to have any more in-depth conversations with you just on planning, potential areas that we can help. But hopefully this gave you some new things to think about, and especially when it comes to setting yourself apart from others. What are those things, like I said, that take you from an A to an A+, right? How do you really wow those consuming your services and your data? And I sincerely believe that some of the suggestions that I've given here will help you achieve some of that. So thank you guys, and let me see if there's any other questions popping in. Nope, none right now. Feel free to reach out to this alias with any other questions that you might have, and thank you for your time, and have a lovely Wednesday.